in the first wave. We're just going to wait for 1 minute before the event starts, but we're aiming for a prompt start as all of our excellent speakers are with us already. We won't keep you waiting too long. Thank you. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this side event for the virtual preparatory committee meetings in advance of the 7th Conference of States Parties to the Arms Trade Treaty. The event is entitled A Comprehensive Approach to Prevent and Mitigate the Risk of Diversion. My name is Paul Holtham, and I am the head of the Policy and Capacity Support Unit at the Small Arms Survey in Geneva, Switzerland. Before we begin, I'd like to inform you that this event is part of a joint project on strengthening shared understanding on the impact of the Arms Trade Treaty in addressing risks of diversion in arms transfers. And the project is implemented by a consortium consisting of Conflict Armament Research, the Small Arms Survey, Stimson, and the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR. We're very grateful for the support provided by France and Germany for this project, which has 3 key objectives. Firstly, to identify progress made by states parties in promoting and implementing effective counter-diversion measures. Secondly, assessing the impact and results of the progress achieved by states parties under the ATT to date in addressing the diversion of arms. And thirdly, to identify options and avenues to strengthen the roles and contributions of the ATT states parties in addressing the changing risks of diversion. Now, in addition to events such as the one we're holding today, and indeed the one that took place just under 1 month ago, we're also releasing a series of publications that we hope will be of use for your preparations for the upcoming CSP and also for implementation of the treaty provisions to tackle diversion more generally. 2 issue briefs were released last year, one on obligations to prevent the diversion of conventional arms, and another on measures to prevent, detect, address, and eradicate diversion. A 3rd issue brief will be released this summer that will provide a diversion analysis framework. Then later this year, we'll be sharing our methodology for assessing the impact of the ATT on efforts to address diversion. And we look forward to engaging with many of you in testing some of our assumptions and gathering information on effective practices and lessons learned in this area. Now, for those of you that attended last month's consortium event on practical tools for addressing the risk of diversion, which took place on the last day of March, you'll recall it was noted several times that all of the speakers from the consortium partners were graduates of Middlebury Institute. So therefore, in the interests of diversity, only half of the speakers for today's event are graduates of Middlebury Institute. We're taking one step ahead at a time with regard to our efforts to address diversity on this panel. Now, we hope that this session serves as an opportunity to share some thoughts on preventing and mitigating the risk of diversion beyond the virtual conference room. And it's my privilege to be able to introduce 4 excellent speakers for you today. We have Ambassador Lansana Gaberi, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone to United Nations in Geneva, and also, of course, the President of CSP7, Rachel Stoller of Stimson, Himayu Shiatani of UNIDIR, and Hayley Gill of Conflict Armament Research. Now, we'll hear from each of the 4 speakers in turn, and then I'll offer them the opportunity to respond to your questions and comments. And indeed, as with previous events organized by Stimson for the consortium, we request that you use the question and answer, the Q&A function that I believe is at the bottom of your screen, if you have anything to say. We also encourage you to raise your questions at any time during the session. So if there's something that Rachel, Himayu, the Ambassador, or Hayley says that you think, I really want to know more about this, please don't hesitate. Please ask your question there and then. Don't wait until all of the speakers have finished before posing your question. Otherwise, I'm afraid we might not get to answer it, and you might have to contact them after this event. So we'll try and finish sharply, as we know that some of you have been up for a very long time, and for some of you, your workday is only just starting. So without much further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first esteemed speaker, Ambassador Lansana Gaberi, as I mentioned, the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone, and also the President of CSP7. His opening remarks for today's session will elaborate upon his thematic priority in the draft working paper, which received such a tremendous response earlier today, and indeed looking at its linkages to efforts to prevent and mitigate diversion within the ATT's framework. Ambassador, the screen is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'll read from a prepared statement, which largely mirrors the one I read today at the meeting, and then we can discuss further if there are questions to be asked and insights to be shared further. Gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really deeply honored to be here to participate in this meeting organized by Stinson, Control Arms, UNIDA, and Small Arms Survey. My intervention, of course, will focus on the main theme of my presidency, which we settled on the day after we got the trust to be president, which is around the theme of diversion, small arms, light weapons, illicit trade in small arms and light weapons. So the theme focuses on strengthening efforts to eradicate the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons and to ensure efficient stockpile management, which is closely linked with efforts to combat diversion, of course. You all know where we are coming from, the history of Sierra Leone, the recent history of civil war, of disarmament. And in my previous life, I worked for the United Nations monitoring arms embargoes in several countries in West Africa and elsewhere. So I came to these talks with that kind of experience, which convinced me that it is extremely important. So with this theme of my presidency, the focus is on the role of states, on arms manufacturers and exporting nations in promoting responsible, accountable, and transparent conventional arms transfer systems and enhancing stockpile management and disposal by states. This priority was significantly highlighted in the 2020 ATT resolution. The resolution was adopted with an overwhelming majority of votes of 150 yeses. And it contained the preamble paragraph PP5 on small arms and light weapons, and the first time included an operative paragraph expressly urging states and signatory parties to prevent and eradicate the illicit trade in conventional weapons, including small and light weapons as set in Article 6 and 7 of the treaty, and to prevent diversion to unauthorized end users of conventional weapons inter alia through efforts to improve efficient stockpile management. You may know far better than we do about how often weapons legally acquired by states end up being used by forces that they were not meant for. Illicit transfers, as you know, and diversions from official stockpiles have become extremely significant in conventional arms regulation in many countries in Africa and elsewhere. The United Nations Conference on the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and Light Weapons in all its aspects confirms that illicit trade in small arms and light weapons is one of the most significant problems of international peace and security. It is for this reason that I made a deliberate choice right at the beginning, and because of the history of my country, Sierra Leone, and similar countries around the region and across the world, that we decided that this issue must be given some priority in some form. It has never been a forgotten issue. There are so many of you working on it in various forms, but we thought that it should also be at the top of the agenda of the Arms Trade Treaty, or the ATT. And we thought we will use this presidency to focus on it, to make sure that the conversation is heightened, it continues. And hence our focus on efficient stockpile management as a tool contribute to the effective implementation of the ATT, particularly preventing and mitigating diversion of conventional weapons from illicit to illicit markets. That is part of the problem, a core of the problem, one of the key areas that have proven extremely difficult to handle, and that needs constant attention. Attention can quickly shift away from one problem to the other. The world is full of problems. So it is important to put emphasis on certain problems continuously and not to forget that these problems exist, because they do, and they cause major trouble across the world. Leading up to this week's preparatory meeting, I circulated, as you all know, a draft working paper, which I hope you have read, on this issue. That paper, of course, sets out to consider areas of arms trade supply chain that require further attention by states in the context of existing global regulatory frameworks. In this regard, the draft working paper proposes a set of outputs that states could pursue in the context of ATT's work plan. Stockpile management is a key mechanism to limit the potential that weapons will be diverted post-delivery. Poorly managed, insecure, or unsafe stockpiles can be susceptible to theft, looting, corruption, and illegal sale, fueling diversion, and the illicit trade in small arms. I was involved at the marginal level in looking at the aftermath of the fall of Gaddafi and the diversion of weapons from the stockpile into the hands of terrorist rebel groups, fueling conflicts across the Sahel through West Africa and leading to the overthrow of the government in Mali and subsequent major problems across the region. So stockpile management, proper stockpile management, has been an issue that has preoccupied me for quite some time now. My presidency in this paper, in this working paper, proposes a set of possible areas for states parties to consider for further inquiry and exchange or longer-term implementation. The proposals contained in the draft working paper aim to address the illicit trade in small arms and light weapons and to strengthen stockpile management and security through the following: mapping and better utilization of existing guidance and tools on the subject. Number 2, post-delivery cooperation and compliance with export documentation, including authorized end use. 3, information sharing on effective and innovative stockpile management programs. And 4, through mandating WGETI to identify and compile a list of existing relevant bilateral and multilateral assistance programs made available to states seeking such assistance. These are fairly modest proposals, which we think are also practical ones. And they were designed to ensure that they are not posed by a large number of interested parties. And the ATT, we operate on the basis of consensus. There might be other radical proposals floating around, more radical proposals than these ones, but we did a lot of deliberation on this in-house, and we consulted with a lot of you, our colleagues out in civil society and other states parties, with the African group, with the ECOWAS, and with various bodies across the world. And we decided that in order for this paper to gain any traction and for the issue to continue to be debated and action to be taken, we have to be modest in what we propose, and commonsensical and try and gain consensus. So this is the basis of this working paper. It aims to generate consensus It also aims to trigger the conversation across the board, and it actually aims to provide a practical solution to the problem, at least to begin addressing the problem in a more practical way. We know that much work has already been carried out on stockpile management, for example, but it remains a huge challenge. So as part of our effort for a more holistic approach as we implement the thematic emphasis and comply with the restrictions imposed by the pandemic, we intend to organize informal consultations during the intersessional period to accomplish this goal. And obviously, we will be getting back to you for assistance in that direction. As we continue to articulate the proposals in the paper and to develop concrete steps, practical guidance on operationalizing the theme within the ATT's existing structures and mechanisms. That's our mandate. It has to be within the existing structures and mechanisms of the ATT. Otherwise, it's not going to go anywhere. I count on the expertise and constructive engagement. We have always, since the beginning of my presidency, I made clear that we consider civil societies as equal and extremely valuable partners. And we would like to, left to us alone, to make sure that civil society is on the table every time and actually make real decisions as state parties. And I think it is very important. Without that, there can be hardly any real progress on quite important critical issues. So we will continue to make sure that civil society is actively involved to the extent that we can. So please consider this as a standing and open invitation to you all. We are looking forward to receiving your views and contributions on our draft working paper as we've outlined above. I thank you all, and I hope we continue the conversation. Thank you for listening to my really boring readout.
No. Thank you, Ambassador. From my side, I think we're extremely fortunate to have you on this panel. You gave a very helpful, very constructive, and a very opening engagement, I think, for many of the people on this session to come back with ideas for you. But from my side, I'm particularly interested to learn about some of those radical proposals that didn't make it into the paper. But I think that many of our audience will appreciate the approach you're taking of triggering the conversation, focusing on the practical, solution-oriented approach, the holistic ideas. I think there's been much take-up. So again, I'd encourage the audience to please pose your questions at this stage. The ambassador left a lot of areas there for further discussion now. And as he mentioned, moving forward in the consultations up to CSP7. But I think now's a good time to start that conversation. And I think to continue the conversation, I'll now turn over to Rachel Stoll, who knows no introduction, I think, for this audience, but Rachel is the Vice President at Stimson. And in a very succinct manner, I'm sure, she'll highlight the explicit and implicit elements of the ATT that address physical security and stockpile management before introducing us to a new Stimson diversion questionnaire to help licensing officers combat diversion. Rachel, the screen is yours, and I'm sure the conversation will continue. So please.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ambassador. And thank you to our partners for participating in the site event. I'm pleased to see, I just scrolled through the participants list to see so many civil society and government partners. It really is a partnership when we're thinking about ways to address this issue. So very, very pleased to be here this morning and to share with you some thoughts about how we connect the president's very important theme to how we can prevent and mitigate diversion. I think it's really an interesting idea to expand sort of the way we think about the ATT and the topics that we include in our conversations and becoming more practical in our thoughts about implementation. So I want to do two things today. First is to discuss how, and I'm just going to say PSSM, Physical Security Stockpile Management, just to save some words, is discussed in the ATT, both explicitly and implicitly. And then, as Paul mentioned, highlight the new resource that we launched a few weeks ago that many of you we're at that can help licensing officers combat diversion. So again, what are the tools that we have in our growing toolbox to not only implement the ATT, but to actually be impactful and to accomplish the goals that the ATT set out. So let's start with stockpile management. Earlier drafts of the ATT did have a specific reference to ensuring safe and secure stockpiling and storage of conventional weapons. But in the final treaty text, there's really only one explicit reference to stockpile management, and that is in Article 16.1 on international assistance, where stockpile management is actually referenced as an example of the type of assistance that may be sought by those looking to implement the treaty. Because PSSM really has to do with the control of weapons within a country's borders, it's not really part of the international trade per se. It's absent from being referenced in ATT articles. But there are many implicit references to PSSM that I think represents good practice and part of treaty implementation that I'll talk about in a moment. So at Stimson, we did an initial review of all the ATT initial reports to see if states were reporting themselves on ways in which they have implemented PSSM as part of their implementation efforts. And we actually found 6 states that did reference PSSM. Some offered very generic references to having a certificate for security measures. Some mentioned safe storage capacity. Others provided specific descriptions of what say that 5 times fast, safe storage might look like in their state. And there's also a case where we have a state providing or offering assistance to help with PSSM. There's also how record keeping is included in sort of efforts to have greater PSSM. So we can talk about later how states and which states are reporting, but there are states that do think about PSSM when completing their initial reports. I think we can look at references to Article 7 and 8 with regards to risk information and information sharing. But most particularly, we've seen states think about PSSM with regards to Article 11 on diversion. So there is in Article 11 provisions that require the exporting state to undertake a risk assessment and for exporting and importing states to implement joint mitigation measures to prevent diversion, which could include things like capacity building to ensure safe storage. States must also take appropriate measures after detecting a diversion of transferred conventional arms, and an appropriate measure would not be informing others about unsafe storage, but rather strengthening your storage facility. So there's ways in which states can be proactive to address potential diversion risks. And of course, states must share information to better comprehend and prevent the diversion of transferred conventional arms, which could include, for example, sources of diverted weapons, such as insecure storage facilities. You can also think about PSSM in articles related to record keeping and reporting. So in Article 12.2, states are encouraged to maintain records of transferred conventional arms, which could include records on weapon stockpiles. In Article 13.2, states are encouraged to report effective measures to address diversion of transferred conventional arms. The report on diversion really has never been standardized, and no state has submitted such a report, but you could imagine a scenario where elements concerning PSSM are included in that report. And I would also say that states can report on their PSSM activities on measures to implement the ATT under their Article 13.1 obligations. Indeed, when states completed the Arms Trade Treaty Baseline Assessment Project Survey, which we conducted before the ATT primarily entered into force, we specifically asked states about PSSM. So we asked states if they required stockpile management assistance. Of the 61 states that responded, 17 answered yes. On the flip side, when we asked states if they were in a position to provide assistance, 47 states responded to the question and 19 answered yes. So there was an interest in that cooperation for PSSM. When we asked states to provide information on any specific assistance programs that they had provided that may help others implement the ATT, states also provided direct mention of stockpile management assistance that they had provided in the past. So again, thinking about PSSM as a way to help states implement the ATT. We also asked states to provide information on specific assistance they have received that could be considered relevant for ATT implementation. Among those states that responded, several mentioned receipt of PSSM assistance, including to upgrade their standards, how they worked with UN regional organizations, and how they began to develop their own processes to develop their own management of stockpiles and destruction that goes along with that. So when I think the bottom line is when we ask states about PSSM, they have things to share. They have things to say. We just need to get that conversation going, as the ambassador said. Now, in addition to the specific inclusion of PSSM in Article 16 on international assistance, Article 15 on international cooperation also refers to the exchange of information on lessons learned in reference to all aspects of the ATT. So again, an early version of the treaty had a reference here to stockpile management as one area where states could provide information on lessons learned. But again, the final text leaves open the possibility for information exchange on this topic. So I don't have time to go into this today, but when we look at state reporting to the ATT, we also look at synergies with other instruments. And obviously there are very clear synergies between the Arms Trade Treaty and the Program of Action on Small Arms. And PSSM is a very clear example where the POA is far more explicit in its inclusion of PSSM. And that's a relationship we can discuss further. And I'm happy to discuss in the Q&A how the POA handles PSSM, but it could be a lesson learned for the ATT in general. I do want to turn quickly to diversion because there's a lot of really good work that is being done on the topic of diversion. And I know Paul mentioned it at the outset, but we're really so pleased to work with really the leading organizations on this topic to develop tools and resources that really can help states think about how diversion is relevant to the ATT, how they can implement practical measures, and how we can actually live up to the promise of the ATT to stop illicit and irresponsible transfers. So working with Small Arms Survey, UNIDIR, and Conflict Armament Research, as Paul mentioned at the outset, there have been numerous reports on these very topics. And last month, we released a report with the support of the Government of Ireland that was a status update on some of the initiatives within the ATT process that aim to help states minimize the risk of weapons diversion, as well as provide a good practice compendium on methods that states can use to help address and mitigate such risk. So the report, of course, includes recommendations for states to improve their national policies. But what I want to quickly talk about is a questionnaire for licensing officers that we hope will serve as a useful tool for governments. The report draws on existing research done by particularly Small Arms Survey and Conflict Armament Research on good practice. We also conducted interviews with licensing officers. We analyzed the public arms trade treaty reports and the UN POA on insights for states' practices to prevent, detect, and address diversion. What I want to highlight is the fact that diversion, and I see, as we're talking about today, PSSM, it's really become a key area of focus for the Conference of States Parties. And I really do think that's a good thing because we're talking about the ways in which states have developed good practice to prevent and mitigate diversion, organized within two approaches of measures to prevent and mitigate the risk of diversion and measures to for states to take when a diversion is detected. I want to mention that what this report does is really provide licensing officers with a tool so they can effectively implement the ATT and to prevent and mitigate diversion. So there is a guidance questionnaire in the report It is not every question that a licensing officer can ask. There are many others, and we think of this as sort of an iterative document where you can add additional questions that you find most useful. But it really helps for these licensing officers to have a set of questions to discuss with their information sources when they're undertaking their own risk assessment as part of the treaty. So we develop these questions in partnerships with governments by asking licensing officers what kind of information would be most helpful to them when they're making their license decisions and identifying potential mitigation strategies. Some of the questions are open-ended, others have specific criteria. Again, we want this to start a conversation, and there's many more questions that licensing officers could and should ask. And if you're not getting the correct answers from your information sources, then you can't actually make a good decision about those transfers. So we want licensing officers to be able to do their due diligence and for information sources to know what kinds of questions to expect. So I'm going to end there, but I just want to conclude by reiterating that PSSM and diversion are really relevant to a much larger conversation about ATT implementation. And I'm very pleased that the president has a working paper that's looking towards having those conversations. We've often, in the ATT context, gotten very stuck in process and setting up bureaucracy. And it's delightful to have this ability to look at actual practical measures and getting to the work of doing and implementing the ATT. The prioritization of efforts to prevent and mitigate diversion is really important. We have numerous initiatives, we have numerous opportunities to discuss potential measures, identify specific cases, exchange information on good practice. And so we really need to take advantage of all of these multifaceted and well-coordinated approaches if we want to see them be effective. We need national level support, we need a whole of government approach, and we really need to be having these conversations at the international level. So we really look forward to working with our partners and states to support these efforts, and happy to answer any questions as we continue.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you for helping us navigate the treaty text and then giving us a very nice forward-looking shift from process to practicalities and priorities. And I am sure I'm not alone in trying to get to grips with your tongue twister of safe and secure stockpile storage in a state party. I'll be teaching that one to the kids later on today. And thank you also for introducing the issue of synergies, which I'm sure we'll be coming back to in the question and answers. And as I've said before to all of the participants in this meeting, please don't be shy. Get your questions in now. Otherwise, we might wrap up before we get a chance to address them. I'll turn the table now to someone that I wasn't sure he would be here. This is the unpredictable part of the event for me. He still might disappear halfway through his presentation if his first child decides it's a good time to enter the world. So I think I should rush up with my introductory remarks and say, I'd now like to turn over the screen to Himayu Shiatani, the Conventional Arms Program Lead at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Himayu will situate stockpile management in the transfer chain before identifying opportunities for cooperation and assistance in the ATT framework on this issue. And I certainly hope that he can stick around till the end of the presentation, but he'll certainly be excused if he needs to disappear sooner. So Himayu, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Very kind of you. Colleagues, friends, my name is Himayu. It's a pleasure to be here with our partners from Stimson, Conflict Armaments Research, Small Arms Survey, but also with the presidency. Ambassador, thank you for being with us, and it's a pleasure to be sharing this panel with you. At the outset as well, Paul, if I could, I just want to also emphasize this partnership being supported by France and Germany, for which we're very grateful. And in this regard, I want to just share a screen. I've prepared a very brief presentation for this session. Just let me know if you see it. Yeah, I hope you do now. Perfect. Okay, I'll start with the first, just general introduction first. Who are we? For those who are not familiar, we're the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, and we're more or less an autonomous independent think tank within the UN looking at arms and international security issues. And we really specialize on 4 services, which are knowledge, ideas, dialogues, and advice. And we're very pleased to be here today. I will focus my presentation just building on Rachel's, looking at situating the issue of stockpile management in a broader supply chain security dialogue. In doing so, I want to make maybe 3 points. First, we promote a comprehensive approach to this discussion. And when we talk about comprehensive approach, we are looking at how in the full life cycle of the supply chain, do we make sure, or what can states do to put in place security, preventative, and mitigation measures? This is number 1. Number 2, we approach this conversation also from a cooperation perspective. We believe that this discussion about responsible arms trade and how to deal with stockpiles is really about cooperation between entities involved in a transfer. Third, we also believe that in terms of an entry point for cooperation, preventing and mitigating risks of diversion is key. So what you see here in the first diagram is something that we're sort of borrowing from our partner here, Conflict Armaments Research. Haley, I hope you don't mind. But basically, it's to paint a picture, somewhat oversimplistically, but to paint a picture to say, where exactly does the issue of stockpile security fall when we discuss the issue of supply chain security? Or when we're talking about arms trade, where we're really focusing on export controls, where does this really come in? And this diagram that Conflict Armaments Research developed is really useful because it really helps us understand that when we talk about stockpile management, we cannot do so without thinking about, first, supply chain controls. In other words, how do states that are exporting or providing supplies think about the security of those items beyond, let's say, risk assessment that they do initially? But at the same time, as we said, this is a cooperative effort. So once the item is received on the recipient side, there are measures in place that states would put into place to secure those items, but it doesn't necessarily end there either. There are monitoring and governance and oversight mechanisms that states typically have at the national level to make sure that those items are secure and then also not diverted. And those, let's say, measures, which I'll elaborate further, will feed into the considerations and the dialogues that the parties involved in a transfer could have at the supply chain control side. So what do we mean by cooperation? What do we mean by comprehensive approach? Rachel very clearly talked about Articles 7 and 8 of the Arms Trade Treaty, in particular Article 7 on export assessments. Of course, many states in their mechanism of risk assessment already include some form of a risk indicator, looking at whether or not the recipient has adequate capacity and capability to manage these items securely. But if we flip the coin, you could also ask the question, do the recipients need the necessary infrastructure to secure these items as part of a transfer? What are their needs? So in this regard, the entry point here really is to look at this assessment cooperatively, number 1. Number 2, we have often found as well that when we think about transfers, there are clear actors like export licensing officers or those who are preparing end user documentation from the recipient side that cooperate. But what we found in our research is that beyond that point, where those records may be kept on end user certificates, once the item is then distributed down the supply chain to the ultimate end users, the adherence to those end user obligations or assurances that may have been agreed between the parties that were involved in the transfer may not be fully understood by the actors that are actually managing those items down the supply chain. A clear typical example that we can share is that, 1 year you may have a Ministry of Defense. This is theoretical, or let's say this is illustrative example. Ministry of Defense may request an item for its military, let's say army, to import an item for their needs with an exporter. They prepare an end user documentation. They send that to the let's say supplier, and the supplier and the importer agree as part of an assurance that they will not re-export that item. 10 years later, in the same country, there is a need for a police force to equip themselves, and there's a surplus from the military. And the item, for basis of need and services, is transferred to the police. Now, this may seem like a natural process in a practical point of view, but depending on the agreement that was made between the original exporter and the importing entity that signed off on the end user certificate, that may constitute a violation of the no re-export clause if that information was not transmitted down to the decision makers domestically. So point being here is that there is more that can be done to truly be inclusive in the dialogue of roles and responsibilities. Third, this is an important and an interesting angle, which is about assurances. In other words, in simple terms, this is a promise that is made between the supplier and the recipient as to how these items may or may not be used and who may use it or not. Interesting point here is that there's an opportunity that we've seen state parties make use of recently, where they tie a type of an assurance, type of a promise that is very closely tied to a measure at the post-delivery stage. For example, marking. At the time of the transfer decision, the exporter and the importer agree that at the time of import, the importer should mark the weapon. Now, this is not something that is out of, let's say, thin air. There's already commitments that all states have agreed to under the program of action. For example, when it pertains to small arms and light weapons, that import marking should be undertaken. So in other words, it's a creative way that we've seen states exercise use of assurance to tie it to physical security measures at the post-delivery stage. And the question I pose to all is, what more can be done, or what are some of the more clear examples that state parties have already utilized? Can that be shared? Linked to this, of course, is assistance. We have seen increasingly that sometimes supplying states, depending on the type of item, whether high risk or not, or the type of end user, they may say, okay, this item, for example, man-portable surface-to-air missiles, are particularly high risk item, but we understand that security measures are, let's say, those items are needed by the recipient, but we're going to tie into that additional security measures and assistance programs to make sure that the recipient can secure those items after they've been delivered. We've seen that in terms of practice that state parties have exercised, or member states have exercised more broadly. Can we map these out? Because they could be a very good, interesting reference points for state parties for further dialogue. But this is not all. There's cooperation available as well. When it comes to the end-use monitoring and diversion monitoring aspects. In particular, if there were agreements already in place between the parties involved in a transfer, that if their items that were transferred does get diverted, whether intentionally or by accident, that they would cooperate to investigate the type of diversion, or that they would exchange information on that. That already is doing more than what we would see typically in terms of cooperation, but it does open an entry point to have a dialogue about how to secure better stockpiles if that item was diverted or deemed to have been diverted from a stockpile. All of these are just ideas, illustrative things that we've mapped out from practices that states have already undertaken, but it does open an opportunity for good practice and lesson learned. So what are some ideas? Ambassador, I'm looking at you in particular, because you might, you noted already that you will have some intercessional dialogues. So perhaps I can put some thinking hat on for the participants also think about. First,
I'm taking notes.
Excellent, Ambassador. So I'm thinking first, first question is record keeping. Rachel talked about this in terms of Article 12, but we have found in practice that record keeping on end user documentation is kept by one party domestically, but not maybe shared or accessed by others who are ultimate end users down the line. What's the challenge here? The challenge here, in fact, is that there is an understanding by a particular national authority about their assurance obligations, but that is not understood by practitioners domestically, which opens up scope for technical, let's say, diversion violations. So there's an opportunity here to ask the question, what more can be done on record keeping, first and foremost. Second, pre-distribution accountability measures. What do we mean by this? What we found in our research is that there's a lot that states already do pre-transfer, and there's a lot that states already do when the item is received at the country. But after it's received and before it's distributed down the supply chain, there are measures like record keeping, marking, initial accountability measures that can be undertaken by states on the recipient side that increases the confidence. Now, this is something that we have found that is meriting of a dialogue between the party that is exporting the item and the recipient in terms of what more could be done at the assurance stages. And this goes into the third idea, which is, can we map some of these assurances out? So one example that we've seen is that while not explicitly mentioning this, but we've seen state parties as part of an end user documentation and as an assurance reflect language of Article 6 of the treaty to say these items shall not be used to commit violations of human rights and humanitarian law. Thereby, while the documentation itself is not legally binding, the assurance becomes open to discussion on implementing a legal obligation of the ATT. Why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because there are different assurance measures that increase the confidence of measures that can be taken at the post-delivery stage, including stockpile management. And one additional one that I will highlight is old for new program. Of course, this is something that you may be familiar from the practice of Germany. But this asks the question, what are you doing with your old equipment before you acquire a new one? And this is just, at the higher level, it's asking the question, how are you managing the equipment you already have? And this is an example of an assurance-like system at a post-delivery stage that integrates the thinking around stockpile management and beyond, in particular, disposal. Now, more that we think that can be done, of course, is on diversion monitoring. And here I will defer, of course, to Haley and my colleagues from conflict armaments research. They're really, really good place to talk about this. But we do think that there are assistance that can be provided more on improving counter-diversion monitoring measures or loop-back mechanism, as we call it. For example, tracing. What can we do more in terms of cooperation and assistance to trace items that have been diverted that can inform decision-making of the exporter, original exporter as well, as to how their mechanisms and risk assessment is working or not working. And lastly, if this all sounds like a too wild of an idea, one can start practically as well. You don't need to start with all conventional items for all end users. You can be more targeted. One could look at high-risk items in particular, if it fell into the wrong hands, or if there were particular end users that were operating in a particular high-risk environment, maybe these assurance cooperation elements become more relevant. So these are just ideas that I can put on the table for further dialogue. To conclude, Paul, if you may, and I hope I'm keeping to time, I just want to just reference very quickly some tools that we already have that you could use. One is a baseline assessment methodology at the national level. Ambassador, you might recall we had a cooperation with your government to undertake this exercise in a comprehensive way not too long ago, looking at what measures the country at the national level has on effective management of arms and ammunition throughout their full life cycle. And by doing so, one is able to map existing capacities and areas of, let's say, increased cooperation, not only on stockpiles, but also on transfer controls. There are other resources that we've developed together with Paul Holton, for example, on many of options to strengthen end user controls. Paul also mentioned a new upcoming publication that we're coming up with as partnership here called Typology Framework for Diversion, which helps out to map different types of diversion that takes place in the incident points as a research reference point that can further facilitate dialogue among state parties about the types of diversion and the countermeasures that could be taken. So these are just example frameworks and tools. I'd be happy to share links to these subsequently. But Paul, without taking too much more time, I will give it back to you. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Himayo. I couldn't cut off a father to be in full flow, although you need to look out your watch again for timing your wife's contractions. Otherwise, you could be in for a rude surprise. Ambassador, I also see where some of these radical ideas that you mentioned earlier came from, but I think that, Hima, you've given us a lot of good food for thought, and I'm confident that you'll be provoking a lot more discussions and questions, and I see some questions already coming in. So thank you to the participants that have already posted some questions to the panel. Keep them coming. And thank you, Hima, also to your family for letting you join us. It was very good to have you with us. So finally, last but by no means least, I'm delighted to be able to turn the screen over to Hayley Gill, a tracing officer with the tracing unit at Conflict Armament Research. Hayley will explain some of the factors that conflict armament research has identified as being beneficial to a successful trace response and subsequent diversion detection. And I understand that some of the elements she'll be addressing were highlighted in the Diversion Digest, A Case for Tracing, which was published at the end of last year, and is a nice way, I think, to round off our discussion from sort of the treaty discussions on process and moving into the practical tools for preventing diversion. So Hayley, without any further ado, please, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. We're really looking forward to how to share our findings on the latest Diversion Digest and our tracing operations. So just for those of you who don't know us, CAR was established in 2011 with the specific intent to trace weapons and related material in conflict. And as you said, I work as part of the tracing unit. We deploy small teams of investigators to work with national defence and security forces to document weapons, ammunition and related material after they've been seized. This weapons and ammunition data is loaded into CAR's iTrace database, which has been funded by successive grants and council decisions from the European Union since 2013. iTrace was set up to provide states with field-based information to inform diversion risk assessments and counter-trafficking mitigation measures. Since 2014, we've documented more than 600,000 items from 28 countries of manufacture, which actually corresponds to around 12,000 individual cases of diversion. And together, CAR's field investigations and tracing operations generate unique evidence on how diversion is occurring. And we do this to help states and other stakeholders identify gaps, vulnerabilities, and loopholes in the supply chain. This enables export agencies to better understand risks of future diversion. So as Paul mentioned, in December 2020, we released our third publication in our Diversion Digest series, which was funded by the European Commission on the importance of timely and comprehensive tracing as a critical practical measure to address diversion. For those who are unaware, tracing, as defined by the International Tracing Instrument, is the systematic tracking of illicit small arms and light weapons found or seized on the territory of a state from the point of manufacture or the point of importation through the lines of supply to the point at which they became illicit. Tracing is a powerful counter-diversion tool, and the process provides formal independent alerts of post-export diversion and weaknesses in national transfer controls, which might otherwise go undetected if people didn't receive these trace requests. So we found that for many national governments, a trace request can flag diversion and notify that something's gone wrong in the supply chain, even if the precise circumstances aren't yet to be understood. So as our partner project proved, the tracing is not only an effective practical measure to address diversion, but a necessary tool to enhance cooperation and between actors. Before I go into the findings, I would like to take this opportunity to express how grateful CAR is to all of its trace partners, many of which have been built over a number of years that respond in detail and demonstrate the mutual benefit of the information sharing process we have when we send and receive trace responses. So over the 5 years of tracing operations between 2014 and 2019, CAR issued over 3,000 trace requests to national governments, manufacturers, private companies, brokers and intermediaries, which elicited over 1,200 formal trace responses, which is a 40% response rate. And this issue of our Diversion Digest is an analysis of the archive of responses and a review of what factors contribute to a successful trace response. So I'll dive into some of the key findings of our research, specifically the factors that we have found as being beneficial to investigations and enhancing the ability to conduct effective diversion risk assessments. So the graphic presented on the slide illustrates how the number of trace requests sent regionally has great variation, and so does the response rate. European states respond to the highest degree, with Eastern Europe receiving the highest number of trace requests and achieving the second highest response rate. The ATT affirms cooperation and information sharing is critical to addressing diversion, and this process is demonstrated by tracing, with exporting states playing a critical role in this process. The extensive cooperation received over the years is evident, with some states responding to over 95% of CAR's trace requests, which is great. And an alert provided by a trace request can identify the precise mechanism of diversion that's occurred, presenting a red flag for possible nefarious actors and entities. When they receive this red flag, it might encourage recipients to implement new policies and measures to prevent misuse, such as restricting transfers to a particular region or intermediary. On the basis of CAR's data relating to one specific case, at least 3 EU member states denied export licensing to a red flagged importing state. So upon analysis of CAR's trace response archive, it became evident there is high variation in the amount of evidence provided by recipients. Nearly half of all CAR's responses confirmed the recipient of a transfer, which is often the most integral information to onwards investigations, enabling us to continue the trace process with the identified entity. Thorough responses describing the supply chain in detail, supported by transfer documents such as end-user certificates, help to identify the source of diversion, make the trace process work, and thus inform the development of targeted counter-diversion measures. When any of this information on the screen is missing from a trace response, it can limit the effectiveness and the clarity of onward investigations. Transfer documents we found often include the quantity of delivery, and 32% of CAR's responses included these transfer documents. And CAR found that an additional 162 million units of weapons, ammunition, and related material have been reflected in these responses to the 3,000 trace requests sent, which allows CAR to develop a bigger picture of the possible proliferation in the location where the traced item was documented and inform the trace partners we have in country. So as Mayu said, records are essential to mapping the full chain of custody and identifying the point of diversion. Unique identifying marks on the weapon ensure its traceability, but only when they are registered in effective record keeping systems. We found that in 30% of our attempted tracing, an absence of records inhibited our investigations. Some of the challenges, such as a lack of records due to disintegration of a stay, are almost impossible to address. However, others, such as record expiration periods, they may be much easier to overcome. So the figure on the screen illustrates one example of which we do have many showing this in practice. The item was manufactured in 1988, but the manufacturing state only keeps export records for 10 years. So by 1998, all the records had expired. The item was recovered in 2019 from an armed group that had been recently using it in conflict. This highlights 20 years where the weapon well surpassed the manufacturing government's own record retention period and the minimum record keeping obligations required by the ATT. And then, of course, the outcome of this meant that Carr's investigation was brought to an abrupt halt, and we were unable to identify how the item had been diverted. This is common. Our experience has found that diverted weapons far outlive their records, with 71% of the weapons in our database older than the ITI's recommendation for import records and export records to be kept for at least 20 years. So this shows the importance of exporting states adopting national record-keeping systems that go beyond these minimum legal obligations set by the ATT or recommended in other policy instruments. Ideally, records would be kept indefinitely to support the diversion detection and investigation. Despite these minimum record-keeping requirements, CAR has received responses from ATT state parties that show export records that go back much further than the thresholds specified in the treaty. For example, CAR received one response that referred to serial number records from the 1930s. So on the screen now is a case study detailing a relatively old weapon that was recently exported and successfully traced, demonstrating the value of export records, as I just explained and referenced by Rachel. Between late 2019 and early 2020, the Burkinabe forces of the Gendarmerie Nationale conducted a vast counterterrorism operation in the Sahel region of Burkina Faso. Gendarmerie personnel trained by CAR documented the military equipment that was seized, including 30 assault rifles. In collaboration with the authorities of Burkina Faso, we traced these items with the manufacturing governments. The exporting government of one of the rifles, manufactured in the 1980s, confirmed that the weapon was exported to a broker who in 2013 exported it to the Ministry of Defense of Mali. We provided this information to the Burkinabe court and we facilitated dialogue between them and their Malian counterparts. So this case just highlights the added value of capacity building in data collection and tracing, and the role that non-governmental organisations like CAR can play in supporting local authorities to identify diversion mechanisms as well as trafficking routes. The majority of our trace responses from ATT member states are for small arms and light weapons, and wherever possible, we trace ammunition as well. Compared to the durability of weapons, ammunition needs to be replenished at a far faster rate, and as a result, measures taken to control unauthorized access to ammunition could have a greater immediate impact on conflict intensity than measures enacted to control weapons alone. CAR has previously spoken on the obstacles that complicate successful ammunition tracing, such as large production runs that lack ammunition, that lack unique marking and can be sold to numerous recipients. But despite these challenges, we have conducted almost 400 successful ammunition traces. Our practical experience in conflict has also identified the presence of a number of related and dual-use non-conventional items being adapted for conflict, often recovered alongside these conventional weapons. So we found that the inclusion of tracing ammunition and non-conventional material and identifying where these items were procured and the transfer routes taken may reveal common transfer and procurement routes that are shared through both non-conventional and conventional items, and provide an opportunity to interrupt these supplies. So to conclude, CAR considers tracing as a critical element among a series of interlocking activities designed to fill knowledge gaps, address the illicit trade, and help national governments address destabilising instances of diversion in the future, which is only possible through practical and collaborative information sharing. As with our previous digest, we have outlined a number of options for states to consider when looking to enhance their tracing impact, including engaging in accurate tracing, such as identifying serial numbers, encouraging tracing of all material party to conflict, including ammunition and non-conventional material, to maintain accessible records indefinitely, and to cooperate effectively and respond in full, providing the highest level and most expansive response requested in a trace request. Thank you.
Thank you, Hayley. I can see already that our presenters have really given a nice complimentary presentations around the issues of cooperation, record keeping, information sharing, the tone set by the ambassador, I think, has flowed through the presentations that have followed. And therefore, it's no surprise that a couple of the questions I've seen so far are sort of directed to all of the speakers. And so I just want to thank all of those who've put questions in already, encourage you to supply more questions now before we run out of time. We're going to try and keep to the schedule. And so we have roughly 20 minutes or so for question and answers. And I propose doing 2 rounds. I don't yet see an avalanche of comments and responses coming in, but I'm sure that Hayley, you've provoked them with some good points again around the work that you've carried out as part of conflict armament research in this domain, and given us some good practical insights to round off the presentation. So I'm going to start with 2 broad questions that have been posed by the audience, and then one specific one. So broadly, we have a question about, for an importing state, what can it do to regulate imports in whatever format they take? In particular, those transfers that are not conducted between 2 states in terms of a donation or some form of gifting. What steps can be taken by an importing state to prevent diversion? We've had some hints and tips, but this is something that I think that can be posed to all of the presenters in terms of their experiences and the research they've conducted. The second specific question that I've got is flipping it around a bit, I guess, from the exporter's perspective. What role could physical security and stockpile management considerations play in pre-export risk assessment? We've had a few examples, I think, provided by some of the speakers, but this is a chance to elaborate, if you would like to, a little bit further on these sort of practical elements that can be done. And I'd encourage the speakers also to think again about that cooperation between the importing and exporting, encouraged in the treaty, but I think some of our speakers have already touched on this and ways of going forward. And then the third broad question is, what role could the working group play with regard to sort of thinking about the relation of the existing guidance in the treaty and this specific issue of the illicit trade in small arms and physical security and stockpile management? I note myself that the President's chair has some ideas there to be picked up, but maybe our other presenters have some ideas that could be useful here. And then a final question specifically to Himayu here at this stage on sort of an interesting point about mapping assurances. Have you done any work at UNIDIR into what kinds of assurances might exist? I think you've given a reference to a couple there with regard to human rights and international humanitarian law violations. But there's a question here about, what other states parties might be doing, and is this something that, could indeed be picked up in support of the presidency's agenda this year? So 3 broad questions, and then I think I've got some specific questions to ask you in your next round. I propose going in reverse order. So Hayley, I'll start with you if you have anything at this stage to offer with regard to these broad questions. Sorry, Ambassador, please.
I'm not answering a question or like to ask a favor. I am particularly interested in all the presentations that have been extremely helpful. Hayley's, but there's something that I'm learning about only now in any great depth. That's tracing in action, the data collection, and I am particularly interested in the Mali case. We are in weapons that had disappeared apparently, traced someplace. I mean, do you have a paper on that? Other examples of that? I'm sorry, Paul. I didn't want to lose that thought. Thank you.
Please, Ambassador, take advantage of this opportunity. And Hayley, you're up first. So if you have an immediate response, please go ahead. If you need a bit more time, we're happy to come round on the second round and give you a chance to address then. But I'll turn to you first.
So I don't think that case is public yet, because sometimes when investigations are ongoing, we don't put the information public. But we do have a global weapons database, the iTrace portal, where cases are public. Like the map that I put up on the screen before, we try and map the chain of custody from manufacture, obviously, as many points as we can in the chain of custody. And when we do receive a trace response, these are also mapped on there. That shows the benefit of tracing, because then we can map it and we can show linkages between entities. So that specific case, that isn't public, but there is other cases from locations like Burkina Faso and Mali, where we have identified point of diversion, and they are like pinpointed on the maps. Relating to the other questions with the importing, exporting states, obviously, as I said, everyone to just keep records of everything you can, like serial numbers, fire selector marks, every single mark, obviously in ammunition as well, as many marks and unique marks as possible. With importing states, if they could also mark, which some importing states do, this shortens the trace process. So we know we don't need to go all the way back to the manufacturer. We can just go to the importing state, and then the point of diversion might be found quicker, and it's less of a burden on everyone in the chain. When the last known custodian marks it, it shortens the chain. PSSM. So obviously PSSM is an important preventative measure, whether diversion has happened or not. I wouldn't say I'm an expert on how to improve the standards, but I think it's been identified in the ATT framework repeatedly to develop tailored solutions to understand the nature of the problem of PSSM, and tracing is a diagnostic tool for that. It is hard but possible to identify a specific stock or storage facility that may be responsible for diversion. But our analysis has found that around 12% of cases of diversion were a result of PSSM failings. So any measures that can be to benefit PSSM are great. And the role of the working group. I think this would be a really interesting area for the sub-working group on diversion, on transparency and reporting, to look at things like that. I think the most important thing for me and the tracing unit, what we work on, is to look at ways to facilitate and support engagement between states and other tracing stakeholders. We found, like I said, such high variance in the response rate and the detail provided, that I think this would be a really good thing that the ATT could support.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think it will be an extremely useful tool. Thanks so very much. Thank you. And the idea of also bilateral cooperation, that we have been having that conversation with various major manufacturers and exporters of weapons. There are things that can be done outside of the ATT framework, but it is important that the ATT plays some role, even if just by talking about it. And that's one area that can be enhanced, I believe, by the ATT having a conversation across the board about it. I think that's very important. Thank you. Thanks so very much for the presentation. I'm glad I sat through all of it, and I may have more questions as we go on if we have time. But this engagement should continue. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you also, Haley, for the quick response that you're able to provide there. And again, I think echoing not just your presentation, but some of the points raised by other speakers. And I'm pretty sure that Himayu is going to pick up on your point about importing states and marking, and ways in which, again, this could be something that links in with the manufacturers. So I'll propose that I pass over to Himayu now for his comments and responses.
Thanks, Paul. Haley really set the scene well. So I hope I don't duplicate, but let me start with the last. Yes, there was a specific question about assurances. So I'll start there. The most typical and well exercised and known post-delivery assurance is twofold. First, no re-export clause. In other words, not to re-export without the consent of the original exporter, right? And in some cases, that is, there are no rooms for interpretation. Some exporters say you cannot re-export regardless of the circumstance, but many exporters permit that, but on the consent, a written consent of the original exporter. That's quite common. The second common one, which is less exercised, but there's a willingness amongst the parties involved in the transfer, is delivery confirmation. So at minimum, recipients are very happy to tell the supplier, hey, thanks, got it, all good, everything's intact. It's not really always exercised or requested by the exporter, which is an interesting practice variation, but there's, from the countries that we interviewed, and we interviewed about 50 on this particular point, we found that delivery confirmation doesn't seem to be a challenge for recipient or the importers to provide to the exporter. Now, when we get to the creative side of things, there are some additional variations. So let's start with the one that Haley talked about, marking. So we know, for example, the ECOWAS Convention in West Africa requires states in the region to mark the weapon at the time of import, right? But in fact, the convention goes further and says that the supplier should support that process. And we know for a fact that some states in ECOWAS, when they have imported new material, they've worked with the manufacturer to mark the weapon at the time of manufacture to illustrate or demonstrate the recipient information. So with the ECOWAS logo, serial number, the year of import, so on and so forth. Now, that's a really interesting point that can link up to the assurance, because that could be embedded as an assurance as part of end user documentation. And it's not an additional burden for the recipient state because they are already legally binded to undertake that in the context of the ECOWAS region, for example, right? But I exercise caution here to note that that is not the all-encompassing catch-all solution. As Haley just noted, regardless of that initial, right, import marking that may be done by the original manufacturer, if there's a re-export of that item to another recipient, it needs to be marked again at the time of their import because the supply chain continues, right? So in other words, this is one solution as part of an end user documentation, but not the all catch-all solution. Yes, it's not to be understood as fixing all the problems. Another one is the one I gave an example from before in my presentation, which is certain high-risk items. We know that countries that export manpads, even if they do so to, let's say, friendly other states, there's often an assurance obligation to physically secure those items, and that there may be follow-through monitoring or verification of those security measures to make sure that they're not falling into the wrong hands. So we've seen that also as a practice. More increasingly, as a part of a cooperation assistance perspective, we've seen some suppliers include reference in the agreement, in the contract agreement, to secure those items in line with internationally recognized voluntary guidelines. For example, Mosaic, formerly known as ISACs, or International Ammunition Technical Guidelines, IATGs. So there's an opportunity there for assistance area that we've seen more recently exercised by some, not a lot, but some. And lastly, this is a lesson from sanctions context, yes? But we have seen an increased practice today by the Security Council of something called the partial lifting of arms embargoes. That is quite different to a blanket arms embargo, which sort of stops all flows of arms in and out of a country. A partial lift actually permits the host country to import certain type of armaments during an arms embargo to strengthen the security forces. So in this regard, in that model where partial lifting is permitted, we've seen a lot of assurance measures come in, end user assurance measures come in, whether it may be, for example, that they need to mark, they need to record, or even to the downstream up, let's say, bottom-up approach of verification measures. We've seen that in Central African Republic, we've seen that in Somalia, for example. And of course, Ambassador, you know, from your own country, before the embargo was fully lifted in Sierra Leone and your neighboring country, Liberia, similar practices were undertaken in terms of benchmarks that the Security Council used in the eventual lifting of the embargo. So these are some ideas that we have mapped out from our research. Paul, if I could, just very quickly, I won't talk about the working group because I know Rachel has expertise on this, but on the question of importer and exporter responsibility. First, from the importer side, it's about the needs assessment, really, and to do so thoroughly, because it's about what you have, what you need to have. More, is it aligned with national security architecture and strategy? And do you have the infrastructure and the systems adequate in domestic level to manage new, fresh equipment? Are they compatible with the systems that you have? Number one, needs assessment. Can you cooperate more with the exporter at that stage? Second, when it comes to documentation, could more be done to authenticate these documents by the exporter to make sure that forgeries are avoided? Some let's say actors use the terminology of certification, but that applies mainly to transfer that may go to non-governmental entities. Third, record keeping. We talked about a lot about this, so I won't go more into detail. Fourth, pre-distribution controls. So at the time of receipt, but before they're distributed down the supply chain, what measures could be done? Could they be formed clear, let's say, clarity in roles and responsibilities on that at the domestic level? And finally, bottom-up verification. Once the items have been distributed, can you verify that item across the records up the stream? To the point of the end user documentation, what Haley was noting about. All of this, actually, what I'm elaborating here are actually, if you flip the coin, indicators for exporters as well when they do assessments, right? So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Paul, if I may, I have a couple comments to make. On marking ECOWAS, I mean, I spent quite a bit of time. I mean, it provides a very good framework. But are we sure it's been really effective? I mean, when I was coordinator for the sanctions regime on Liberia, there was the arms embargo had been partially lifted, so it means that arms can be brought into the country, mainly arms donated by UN member states, and this requirement was hardly followed, and the capacity of the national authorities then to do so was very highly limited, and we kept pointing that out. So that I would like maybe a study of that framework, how effective it has been across the board in West Africa. I think Sierra Leone has been doing it quite well to a large extent. I know Nigeria has been, Ghana has been, but I would like to know how other countries are faring in that respect. And that brings me to arms embargo and effective treaty implementation, or even people, you know, and I'll talk about this tomorrow on universalization. We have met states who are not part of the ATT and who would like to join. And some of them are under arms embargo. And they will say, well, I mean, if we decide to join, and you're talking about transparency and all that, this is not going to be extremely wise for us. I mean, how can we be transparent about acquiring weapons for legitimate self-defense? How can we be transparent about that when we are under an arms embargo? And so maybe again that needs to be looked into, and how that may be affecting broader membership of the ATT. Thank you, but thanks very much for Himaye for the presentation. Thank you.
And thank you, Ambassador, for outlining a research agenda for all of the other people, I think, on this call, not just those you can see on the screen, but I think also many of the participants in the audience. But I think that you've hit the nail on the head several times now. So I'm looking forward to your final comments, which I think are going to be extremely pertinent and help us with the road forward. And I'm pretty sure you're going to have a lot of people knocking on your door to say they've got ideas and material that can help with your thinking moving forward. So thank you for your openness and your questions. And Rachel, I'll turn to you before giving the ambassador the last word. A couple of broad questions there, and a few I think that touch on some of the points that you raised in your presentation. So Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks. Really, it's great to also just be an audience member and listen to this really dynamic conversation. So really appreciated the insights. And there's always the danger when you go last amongst a group of experts that, you know, much of what of your perspectives have been shared. I will say that I think, as I mentioned in my remarks, it's not just the role of the working groups, but really I think it's the role of all member states at this point. Now that we have a very good infrastructure set up, now that we have very active working groups with agendas, that we have the luxury to focus on some of these practical measures and really use the working groups to exchange good practice to, as we talked about this morning, even in the working groups, looking at how states define key terms, what are the ways in which they understand their obligations. And so when we start thinking about both the explicit and implicit references in the ATT, it widens the aperture for those conversations. It allows us to be more detailed, to provide examples, whether they're from West Africa or East Africa or Latin America or Asia. We have experiences to draw upon and really learn from. So I think the working groups not only have a role, but there's really a responsibility at this point, 7 years into the treaty's entry into force, that we have to get down to the real work of being practical in our implementation efforts. In terms of the pre-export risks assessment, I think it's really it's along the entire transfer chain. When we talk about ways to prevent diversion, and we look at entry points and leverage points along that chain, and there are different strategies, and Himayu just went into several of them, but there are different strategies. And so we can't think, well, if we do the export assessment before we sell or transfer the items, then we're done. Then our work here is done, and any diversion risk or PSSM challenge is not our concern. And really, we do need to look at the entirety of that transfer chain, of the supply chain, of the life cycle of those weapons, and to constantly reassess and strengthen and build capacity along places which may over time become weaker or stronger, so that we are always thinking about what's next and what are those potential risks. Paul, you asked the question, and I think it was in the chat, about what can importing states do vis-a-vis exporting states and independently and together. And I think the real answer is, as with the ATT, this is not an importer's responsibility, nor is it solely an exporter's responsibility, but it's really a partnership amongst the parties that are involved in those transfers to have open communication, to share information, and to cooperate with each other to ensure that at all levels we have the most up-to-date information. When there is a risk, when there is a problem or a challenge, it is not about judgment. It is not, you've done something wrong and therefore you're bad and you go on the bad importers list and you're not able to access weapons transfers anymore. It's really about acknowledging, here's a challenge in our system and we would like some assistance in strengthening those challenges or those weaknesses so that we can be responsible actors in this trade. So I think it's a sign of strength to demonstrate where there is help needed and to be very open and honest and transparent with all of the parties involved in those transfers. So I think it is both a joint responsibility, it is a whole of government approach. It is not just the responsibility of the licensing officer or just of the customs official. It's really everyone working together in partnership, sort of like this panel where we're all working together and bringing, the different levels of expertise that we have to share what those good practices are. So I'll leave it there as we're running out of time, but really appreciate the vibrant and dynamic conversation today.
Thank you, Rachel. Several key points I think you raised there about sort of trust, confidence building, honesty, transparency, keywords that we're very familiar with and which all too often, unfortunately, are challenges in our domain. But I'd also echo your points about moving away from the fire and forget approach to export controls is something that we're seeing in the ATT context, and I like the way that's been embraced by the ambassador and I think by many of the interventions in response to his working paper earlier today when it was introduced. So, Ambassador, the final word is yours. Please give us some more ideas about how we can help you. And I think from my perspective, what would be interesting also is, what would a vision of success look like for you in terms of your presidency and things where we can potentially, as a group here, all of the people on the call, those on the panel and those beyond, do to help you in the coming months to really deliver on that vision of success?
Thank you so much, Paul. What my vision of success will look like, that's too early to tell. But look, my colleagues, my expert Patrick will be getting in touch pretty soon. Let me take this opportunity to thank you all very much. I've learned a lot just listening to you and engaging you. And I think that the resources that you bring to this is actually invaluable. And I would like to deepen this collaboration in future, and then I'll be touching bases with you as a group and individually as well going forward. This has been extremely useful to me, and I thank you, Paul, and I thank you, Haley, Mayu, and Rachel, Simpson Center, everyone. And this has been terribly useful for me. I don't know whether my colleague Patrick wants to add a word or two before we wrap up, but thank you so very much. Thank you for your insights. Patrick, are you sleeping?
Patrick, you have a chance if you want to say anything, but I think your ambassador has been an excellent keynote for us today, and not just a fantastic presentation, but also really pushing the speakers, I think, to think and elaborate upon some useful ideas, and giving us a lot of food for thought in terms of how to take this issue forward. And I think that we as a consortium are very happy to support you, Ambassador, in terms of where you'll see needs for us and where we can provide support. I hope that for all of you out there in the Zoomiverse, our speakers have tickled your interest in this issue, and that given you lots of food for thought, both for the rest of this week and also for the months leading up to the conference itself. Thank you all for your participation. Keep an eye out for future publications from the consortium and all of its partners, and we'll be in touch with you, I think, fairly soon. So thank you all. Have a great rest of the day, whatever stage it is for you, and look forward to catching up in person, hopefully one day soon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Oh.